Welcome to the concluding instalment of this series of close readings. We have been considering in this series a sequence of poems that it seemed to us had a claim to be thought of in political terms, either literally because they marked real historical events of political consequence, or because they articulated a particular ideology or a particular political vision, or because they have been read politically, whatever their author's original intentions might have been. My name is Seamus Perry. I teach English at Balliol College in Oxford, and I'm talking to Mark Ford, poet, critic, and professor of English at University College London. And today's poem, perhaps a bit of an outlier, Mark, in our choice of poems up until now, is T.S. Eliot's late masterpiece, Little Gidding, first published in 1942, and the last of a series of 4 poems called 4 Quartets, which Eliot had begun to publish in 1936. So 1942 is when it emerges, and that would make it very much a war poem, which I suppose is part of its political character.
Yes, he was writing it in 1941, 1942, and he knew he needed this final quartet to add to what he was thinking of at the time as the Kensington Quartets, but which became 4 quartets. And there are kind of elements, each quartet has an element connected to it, and the element for this one is fire. And of course, the Blitz was happening while he was writing it, and Eliot was a watcher, a fire watcher, would spend all night in Kensington on a roof looking for German bombers and then alerting people. So he experienced London in the Blitz. And in that sense, it's a crisis poem, but built into the kind of crisis, or his reading of the apocalypse, which the Blitz was, are all kinds of religious connotations and interpretations, so that the fire is both the literal fire of the Blitz, but it's also a kind of purgatorial fire from which some new spirit will emerge. So that the poem's vision of history and of England and of Englishness, which is absolutely kind of hardwired into it, is central. And to some extent, it to me, it's a bit like Blake's Jerusalem. It's sort of saying that God is present in England. History is now in England, that this moment of crisis has released this understanding of England and Englishness as being a kind of portal into a Christian reading of the world, which is absolutely decisive and vital. And Eliot, in his prose around this period, would talk about the Second World War as something which wasn't pleasant, but Christians would have to sort of sit it out. And at the end of it, it was proving, he felt, that a secular society could never work. It would collapse. And Christians had to wait patiently. If they waited patiently, this war would destroy secularity, and the idea of a Christian society was he published in 1940. So in terms of its ideology, it's presenting a vision of Christianity as the way in which the world has to be kind of, interpreted. So it binds together all these different elements into an extraordinarily complex and resonant and powerful labyrinthine kind of symbolic echo chamber from which one feels one can never escape. Well, that's been my experience.
Yes, it should be said that, Blake's conception of what Christianity involved was a bit different from what Eliot's.
That is certainly true. But the Jerusalem, the Englishness, and,
yes. So, as you say, a set of poems that are dominated in all sorts of ways by London experience, and yet, obviously, this poem isn't named after Kensington or London. It's named after Little Gidding. Little Gidding, for those of our readers who aren't familiar, is a tiny village now in Cambridgeshire, originally in Huntingdonshire, and it's a slightly odd place, isn't it, for a quartet to be based upon? Because unlike Burnt Norton, which Eliot had visited and had clearly some sort of intense mystical experience there of some kind, and unlike East Coker or the Dry Salvages, both of which were places that had a very, very strong autobiographical connection for him, or a family connection for him, Little Gidding he really didn't have very much to do with, did he? He visits it once when he's going to Cambridge on a kind of jaunt at a weekend, and he stays with the master of Magdalen College, and they motor out to Little Gidding, and he has a look at it. And I think there's one reference in a letter where he says it was, quite a nice day. But nothing, nothing sort of massively kind of life-transforming seems to have happened at Little Gidding in May 1936 when he's actually there. It's only, as it were, retrospectively that it gets invested with this vast amount of symbolic and all spiritual freight.
Well, I think that was because there was the community there, founded by Nicholas Ferrar, who was a friend of George Herbert's, and it was an Anglican community which was there for about sort of 20 years, and towards the end of Charles I's reign. It was then kind of destroyed by Cromwell afterwards, by the Puritans, and Charles I visited there a couple of times in the 30s and 40s, and then in 1646, just before the end, he went to Little Gidding.
Just
and I
after
think
the Battle of Naseby. Yes,
but I think what you're saying is interesting. If the four quartets in some ways are a spiritual autobiography, they end up with something quite communal or collective, and Little Gidding embodies that communality. And a lot of it was written at a commune, Shamley Green, where Eliot sort of hung out with Hope Merley's mum, Mappy Merley's, and the kind of group of women living in Sussex, not that far from Guildford, I think it was. So Eliot's commitment to a kind of communal or collective experience is not only present within the poem's figuration of Little Gidding and that community, but this ideal of a community which would be nurturing and self-sustaining, in some ways at this point in opposition to the mainstream. But the idea is that this example will become central to the way that the history in the world develops in the post-war era. And oddly, the composition was mirrored that he would fire off this poem to John Hayward, then on to Bonamy Dobre, then on to
Geoffrey Faber.
Yes. Geoffrey Faber or Frank Morley, and they would all comment on it. And he sort of elicited all these responses. So there's almost, in relation to what you're saying, a sense of a commitment to the collective or the communal, a small community which is ideal in its ways, and that something almost utopian about it, and that from this seed great things will spring. So I would say that its politics are very kind of cleverly and sinuously and surreptitiously enfolded, to use one of his own terms, into its own language and movements and references, not only to Charles I, but to Juliana of Norwich, who's saying, all manner of thing will be well. And she says that very often. And someone else was saying the same thing very often at the same time. And that was Winston Churchill. Yes.
Yes.
All will be well. So the war is coded into it in all kinds of kind of clever and interesting ways. And we may think, is a German Luftwaffe Stuka really like the Holy Dove? In part 4, those kinds of analogies. But the symbolic methodology of the poem is so kind of sui generis and so kind of confident, even if it seems kind of outlandish to us at times, that I think we do buy into it, though I should say perhaps we buy into it at our peril.
So I think the point you're making is a very, very important one. If you compare it to the first quartet in this sequence, which is Burnt Norton, that's about intensely individual and private kinds of experience, isn't it? And by the time we get to Little Gidding, as you say quite rightly, it is a vision of cooperative spiritual life, or in a way what it is a vision of a church, isn't it? So the religious impulse, which feels lonely and self-haunting in Burnt Norton, has become institutionalized in a funny kind of way in Little Gidding, and it's an attempt to invest the institutions of the church with a kind of poetic grandeur or poetic wonder, I suppose.
Yes, I mean, he joined in 1927. He joined the Anglican Church, and he's always talked about as High Anglican.
Yeah.
And he really, really cared about church doctrine. I mean, and it would, write Thoughts After Lambeth and all these other kind of responses to elements of kind of ecclesiastical policy which he didn't agree with, and to us, it may seem odd that somebody could commit to a vision of the Anglican Church as redemptive and somehow destined to save the world. But I think we have to accept that, and that the poetry does grow out of a kind of theological commitment, which in the process co-opts the whole history of England, that England is seen as leading up to these points. Almost, I mean, Little Gidding is almost featured as a portal into the other world. And of course, it makes use of Dante very extensively. So Dante, particularly in section 2, when he does the bit of poetry of which he was most proud in his life, when the Blitz, when he's fire watching, that passage suggests the ways in which this poem is attempting to do something similar to what Dante did in the Divine Comedy, and that's to create a kind of poetic vision which will make his particular kind of religious convictions seem inevitable, natural, grounded in history, and overwhelmingly convincing. And people did go and join the Anglican Church because of Eliot. I mean,
It was a bestseller, wasn't it?
Yeah,
The pamphlet, if you ever see it in a second-hand bookshop, it's often the 13th or the 15th imprint of.
sold 50,000, I think, in the first few months. And the patriotic elements of it, I think, connect to that, obviously, that this really was good for the English. He was rather dismissive of Churchill, but it does do rather Churchillian things in terms of its political rhetoric.
Yes, it's interesting that the other thing he's doing at the same time as composing this is making a selection of poems from Kipling, which he describes as a piece of war work.
Yes.
And I think Little Gidding is also, in its own way, a kind of piece of war work, isn't it? A contribution to the effort.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Political Poems, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. You can listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series by signing up to our close reading subscription. Go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.